Many media scholars have remarked on the dearth of research on the history of the press in Ireland. This remains a problem, though it has been rectified to some extent in the last decade or so, partly, but not exclusively, through the work of the Newspaper and Periodical History Forum of Ireland, founded in 2008. The forum held annual conferences before the advent of COVID, and these have stimulated much interesting work. In addition, several essay collections have been published, which, promoted or supported by the forum, originated in papers delivered at the forum's conferences and or comprise work by authors who were and are active members of the forum. Mark O'Brien and I, both former chairman of the forum, have edited 2 such volumes on the theme of periodicals and journalism in 20th century Ireland. The first, as Peter said, appeared in 2014. The second is due to be released later this month. Both volumes are published by Four Courts Press in Dublin. These volumes are the focus of my presentation this afternoon. Both seek to address a particular gap in the field of press history in Ireland, namely the links between the periodicals or journals of the 20th century and current affairs journalism. The work that has previously been done on Irish periodicals has tended to concentrate on the journal as literary miscellany rather than as a vehicle for news and commentary. In contrast, the contributors to our volumes attempt to evaluate the specifically journalistic activities of the periodicals published in Ireland in the 20th century, and by extension, their contribution to Irish society and political culture. Roy Jenkins, then British Home Secretary, pointed out in a Granada Guildhall lecture in 1975 that, and I quote, "Choice is as essential to a free press as the prestige of journalists and the protection of resounding constitutional declarations." In other words, there's no genuine freedom of expression in the public sphere unless a wide variety of outlets is available to accommodate those with something to say. In 20th century Ireland, many of the national and provincial newspapers were effectively organs of or associated with political parties or other dominant interest groups, and there was little space for diversity of opinion. J.J. Lee, in his Magisterial Ireland 1912 to 85, notes, and I quote, "the intellectual poverty of Irish journalism and the lack of public demand for superior analysis." He observes in this context that any newspaper which sought to run too far ahead of its readers would quickly become defunct, unquote. Whereas newspapers must appeal to a wide readership, periodicals with a smaller cost base can afford to reflect specialist or minority interests. Thus, the importance of Irish periodicals of the 20th century is that for however small an audience, many projected an alternative view of the world to the narrow one that was propagated by the Irish establishment in its various incarnations, both before and after independence, and which in fairness was accepted by the mainstream media and also by the great majority of the population. By providing an outlet for those writing against the grain of Irish society, they made freedom of expression a reality in Ireland. They created a space for diversity of opinion that was not available in the national newspapers or in the provincial press or elsewhere. And in the last 40 years or so of the 20th century, there began to appear a new breed of periodical that concentrated on the seamier side of politics, promoted investigative journalism, and exposed the often opaque goings-on within the world of Irish business. Not for them the reverential approach to the Irish establishment and the luminaries thereof that characterized the mainstream press. I should emphasize, however, that the voices finding expression in Irish periodicals are not only dissenting voices. There are certainly organs of dissent among the periodicals featured in the 2 volumes that Mark and I have edited. But more typically, Irish periodicals have catered for specific communities within Irish society, which might not otherwise have a voice in the media. In other words, marginalized communities. In our 2 volumes are heard the voices of women, the young, the gay community, religious interests, the Labour and Republican movements, and the Irish Ireland lobby promoting revival of the Irish language. By virtue of their influence on the ideas of an intellectual elite who are the makers of public opinion in Ireland, in politics, the public service, the universities, and elsewhere, many of the periodicals featured in our 2 volumes helped shape the final phase of the struggle for independence in Ireland in the early years of the 20th century, and then post-independence, the thinking that ultimately led to the emergence of a more open Irish society from the late 1960s onwards. Of course, periodicals in Ireland in the 20th century were never anything other than doubtful ventures in business terms. In our 2nd volume, there's a fine chapter by Sonia Perkins on the business of publishing periodicals in Ireland in the period 1930 to 55, and it was often a messy business. Perkins reminds us that despite the editorial accomplishments of the periodicals, they were generally produced in the face of grinding commercial pressures to sell advertising, increase distribution, promote subscriptions, and solicit patrons. Many individual periodicals had, however, a faithful readership that sustained them for quite long runs of publication. And the influence they had via that readership was entirely disproportionate to their circulation levels and profits, if any. They were the fulcrum on which the intellectual foundations of Irish society moved, slowly but irrevocably. They are therefore worthy of study. We have tried to make our 2 volumes as comprehensive as possible. Between the 2 volumes, there are a total of 29 chapters, most of them studies of individual publications, but some survey a number of periodicals with a common purpose and/or the same target audience. 2 refer to notable series of articles that appeared in influential periodicals in the 1940s and 50s. And 1, as already noted, discusses the business aspects of publishing periodicals in Ireland in the mid-20th century. Tom Clyde, in his bibliographical study of Irish literary magazines, identifies the years 1892 to 1922 as, and I quote, the 2nd golden age of Irish literary magazines, the period of greatest fecundity and innovation since the Great Famine. It is therefore not surprising that over 40% of the periodicals considered in our volumes were founded in that period. 1, the Church of Ireland Gazette, was founded even earlier in 1856, and it is still extant. It is, as its title indicates, a newspaper for the Anglican community, the Church of Ireland, throughout Ireland, north and south. In the words of Ian Dalton, in his chapter on the Gazette, published in our forthcoming volume, its role is to keep the minority well informed about itself and the wider world. Ian points out that it has required significant financial support from the church authorities to survive in recent years. And he writes that the church's determination to keep the Gazette going is evidence of the acute sensitivity of Irish Anglicanism, and indeed a wider Protestantism, to its identity and history. The Gazette is seen as integral to both. It is therefore the epitome of a periodical that caters for a specific community within Irish society that might not otherwise have a voice in Irish media. Originally published in Dublin, the Gazette has been published in Northern Ireland since the 1960s. Fortnight is the only other periodical featured in the 2 volumes published outside Dublin. It is one of 4 periodicals in the volumes whose raison d'etre was or is essentially reporting and reflecting on current affairs generally. Published in Belfast between 1970 and 2011, with one brief interruption, it was committed, as stated in Andy Pollock's chapter on the magazine, also in volume 2, to, and I quote, working to make Northern Ireland a functioning society based on democracy, human rights, and equality for all. Its aim, according to Pollock, was to provide a reasoned, neither unionist nor nationalist analysis of that conflicted society, while opening its pages to writers of all points of view. Pollock was editor of Fortnight from 1981 to 1985, and he notes with satisfaction the influence some of its analysis and proposals had on political developments in Northern Ireland. South of the border, the most significant current affairs periodical was Hibernia, published in the years 1968 to 1980. In a chapter in the first of our volumes, Brian Trench characterized it as an independent, frequently dissenting voice in Irish media. In volume 2, Joe Breen writes about the aptly named Phoenix magazine, which for the past 40 years has continued Hibernia's dissenting journalism in another guise. It rose, Phoenix-like, from the ashes of Hibernia, the latter magazine having had to cease publication after a successful libel action against it. Breen describes the Phoenix as having charted a dissenting or alternative history of contemporary Ireland, which tested the boundaries of what was considered journalism, not least by established journalists. It has never therefore enjoyed quite the same clout as its antecedent Hibernia. Its forthright journalism is leavened with satirical humour, especially in its provocative covers in the style of Private Eye in the UK. The most important organ of satirical journalism in Ireland in the 20th century was Dublin Opinion, a magazine started in 1922 in the very first months of the new Irish state. It began with the laudable aim of using the healing power of laughter to counter deep-seated tensions in Irish public life, resulting from the divisions of our civil war. In its later years, Dublin Opinion conveyed serious criticism of politicians and others through the medium of humour. Unlike the Phoenix, its only content was humour, cartoons and short witty pieces. Its purpose was purely satirical. It continued publishing until 1968, a run of 46 years. I contributed a chapter on Dublin Opinion to the first of our 2 volumes, and some of you may recall that I presented a paper on Dublin Opinion at our conference in Athens in September 2019. My chapter in the second volume is about a series of 6 articles that appeared in a periodical called The Bell in late 1944 and early 1945 under the umbrella title, The Fourth Estate. These articles are significant because of the light they shine on Irish newspapers and periodicals at that time, a vital component of Irish society that was otherwise immune from the scrutiny of the Fourth Estate, as I point out in my chapter. The Bell is the preeminent Irish periodical of the 20th century, and its contribution to literature and culture has been the subject of many excellent studies, most recently a book by Kelly Matthews. Its contribution to the development of journalism in Ireland is equally important, however, and that is the focus of a chapter by Mark O'Brien in the first of our 2 volumes, with reference especially to Sean Whalon's editorship from 1940 to 1946, though the Bell survived until 1954. In that chapter, Mark argued that the Bell represented a dramatic intervention in the journalism of mid-20th century Ireland. For the Bell to have trained its sights on fellow newspapers and periodicals, as outlined in my chapter in volume 2, that was certainly a dramatic intervention in that it broke the convention that the press did not hold itself to account, at least not in the public sphere. It is a good example of a periodical working against the grain of Irish society. Obviously, in the time available to me, I cannot discuss or even list all the periodicals that are included in the volumes that Mark and I have edited. I can only point you to the website of our publishers, Four Courts Press, and invite you to view the list of the chapter headings in each volume. Both volumes are rich collections, and the range and variety of the periodicals that our contributors have written about is, I think, impressive. But in conclusion, what, if anything, did the periodicals in question have in common? The most common feature is the omnipresence within each of them of a dominant personality or two, as editor and/or proprietor. The one editor that I've mentioned today, Sean O'Faolain on the Bell, was no aberration. In his role as editor of the Bell, he was described by the critic Vivian Mercer as not just a figurehead, he is the magazine. Most of the other periodicals considered in our volumes can similarly be identified with specific individuals. And this omnipresence of a dominant personality is the generally recognized paradigm for journals, both in Ireland and elsewhere. Another common feature is that the periodicals were and are largely metropolitan phenomena. Even where the periodical was one that championed the ideal of Irish Ireland and a return to the lost paradise of an imagined Irish past in a rural idyll, its message was addressed primarily to urban readers and mainly to Dublin-based ones. The contents of the periodicals are by and large indicative of a middle-class urban elite engaged in public discourse with itself. Finally, these periodicals had in common a certain style, which derived perhaps from a sense of their own necessity. Without them, who or what would facilitate critical thought, or indeed any thought, in the Ireland in which they strove and still strive to exist? They were not always stylish in their physical appearance, but there was a quality in the writing, and in the case of Dublin Opinion, also in its cartoons, that conveyed a confidence that the work they were undertaking was important. It should therefore be done well, and it usually was. Thank you.